vaccine responses in low and middle income countries. And it is focused specifically on vaccine hypo-responsiveness. Now, just to explain what that is, over the years, a number of research studies have observed that there are striking differences in immune responses to vaccines across different populations.
This is Immuno Africa, a podcast dedicated to spotlighting African immunology research. Here, we amplify the stories of Africans researching the immune system to tackle the continent's growing burden of infectious and non-communicable diseases. I am Wealth Okete, a biochemist and science communicator in Nigeria keenly interested in research on immune system. On Immuno Africa, I explore and communicate research through the eyes and lips of Africans who do them. Whether you are a seasoned immunologist, a burdened researcher, or even an untrained person, I hope the time you spent here rewards you remarkably. Enjoy!
Dr. Abena Amoah is the lead for the HypoVax Global Knowledge Hub based at Leiden University Center for Infectious Diseases, Leiden University Medical Center, located in the Netherlands. The hub is focused on understanding variations in vaccine responses across geographical areas and populations. It aims to address the central question of why weaker responses to vaccines are seen in some regions compared to others, and brings researchers from around the world together to make connections and form a strong network. Originally from Ghana, Dr. Amoah was born and raised in Southern Africa. She holds a PhD in immunoepidemiology from University of Leiden in the Netherlands, an MSc in epidemiology from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and a bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the Mount Holyoke College, United States. She has also held postdoctoral positions at both London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, based overseas in Malawi, and Leiden University Medical Center. While she launched her research career exploring addictive diseases in the US, her relocation to Ghana would mark the beginning of her journey into immunology. At the Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research, she coordinated population studies that focused on immune responses to parasitic worms. Over the years, Dr. Amoah's research has focused on immune responses to various pathogens in urban and rural populations. She also has an interest in understanding the mechanisms underpinning protection against or susceptibility to non-communicable diseases in populations in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm happy to have her on this episode.
Thank you so much, Wealth, and thank you for the introduction, and then also for the invitation. Actually, it's quite an honor to be part of this. And I was very intrigued by your podcast because I think that there are not many people who are focused on the field of immunology when it comes to Africa. So it was very exciting. So I'll just talk a little bit about my background. I'm a citizen of Ghana, and I was born and raised in Southern Africa, actually. So I was born in Lesotho and raised, had my primary and secondary education in Eswatini. And then I come from a family of teachers. My father was a professor of law, and my mother was an English teacher. Later, she became a politician, but that's another story, a long story. And I had a passion for biological sciences at that time. I got a partial scholarship to study in the United States, and I did my undergraduate degree in biological sciences at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. And after that experience, I worked for 2 years. So my first laboratory experience was working at Rockefeller University. It was an absolutely great experience, and I worked there for 2 years. And at that time, the focus of my research, or the type of research I was involved in, was really molecular biology. And then as a lab assistant in a lab that studied the biology of addictive diseases, it really was focused on molecular biology and studying the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, and in people who were using illicit drugs compared to people who were not. And so that was the initial, my first introduction to lab work. So then after 2 years working in this environment, I thought, okay, I've never lived in Ghana before in my life. So I thought, wow, this is a great chance to maybe just go off for a year. The idea was to leave the US for a year to go and get some experience in Ghana. So I moved to Ghana And I started off as an intern at the Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research in Accra. It was an absolutely amazing experience. I was in the parasitology department. So actually it was interesting because then after 1 year, I decided actually to go back to the US, pack up all my things and move to Ghana on a more permanent basis.
Interesting.
Which everybody is like, who does that? Because because it's not like most people are compelled to leave the US if they have to leave the US after undergraduate, but I actually left the US and went for this experience in Ghana more long term. When I came to Ghana, initially I was hoping to continue in that field, but interestingly, there was no research studies that were looking at the biology of addictive diseases, or there was very little. Addictions do take place in the African continent, but not really on the scale of research. Then I got into parasitology, and that was where I really was like, oh, this is a whole new field, these parasitic worms, very interesting, malaria. And then from there it was really parasitology. So you have the parasite that actually lives in your system. And the reason why I found immunology interesting was because of the relationship with parasites. The interesting thing about it is that it actually utilizes its host's immune system for its own survival. So it wants to stay. So the parasite schistosoma, which causes the disease schistosomiasis, it wants to live in the host. So because it wants to eat, it wants to survive, it wants to stay in the host, but it doesn't want to kill the host because it knows that if it kills the host, it won't survive. It also puts itself in jeopardy. So why I got interested in immunology was how if you have a chronic infections, you have all these parasitic worms that actually they downregulate your immune system so that they can be hidden in your body. They actually release molecules and set up mechanisms so that your immune system will be tilted in a particular direction to ensure their own survival. So for me, this was very fascinating. It made me realize that, yes, this disease is terrible. And then, it causes, you can get an acute infection, you're in danger. But you have all these populations that are living in areas close to water that are exposed to this parasitic worms through their daily activities in water, but they don't really get sick. And it's because the parasite has adapted the host immune system in a very clever way for its own survival. So that was initially that got me interested in immunology. And when you clear these types of infections, what is happening to the immune system? Because there's an interesting, I don't know if you know about the Hygiene hypothesis and the Helmuth hypothesis. So the idea that when you are, it initially was, started off with the observation that when family sizes in England started to get smaller, you started to have more hay fever. And then the question was that when the family sizes got smaller, you had less opportunities for older siblings giving their younger siblings bacteria and dirt to prime their immune system and protect them against allergies. And in the absence of dirt and all these things that prime your immune system, you may then develop allergies. So people in the field of parasitology have also viewed this in the context of parasitic worm infections, helminths. And what they have noticed is that, yes, so when you clear these infections, you might move more towards an immune profile that makes you more susceptible to allergies.
Interesting.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. I think it does. So basically, it appears when I treat parasitic infections and clear the worms from my system, I may be more susceptible to coming down with allergies.
Yes, or autoimmune conditions. At least that is what the hypothesis and the studies do sort of suggest, that there is that relationship. In the absence of worms, you might be more susceptible to autoimmune conditions, allergies, and maybe even some other inflammatory conditions such as diabetes. But that one, there's research. This is a whole area of research. Mice models might support these observations very clearly, but it's less clear in human studies where, humans, there's so many multiple factors that, influence our immune system. And then also where we were in the ages, between the ages from birth to 5 has always been key in the development of your immune system later. So if you grew up in a rural area in those developmental area times, you may be protected against inflammatory conditions later in life. There's also research to show that. So yeah.
So, in the context of her academic journey, how did she delve into the field of immunoepidemiology?
I was first involved in a study that was looking at the relationship between parasitic worm infections and allergy outcomes. This was my first introduction that combined both parasitology and immunology. And so this was in school children in the Greater Accra region. It was a field project. We would go and sample stool and urine from school children between the age of 5 and 16. And we would look for parasitic worms, which are known as helminths as well. And we would then also collect other data. We would do skin prick tests to check if they had allergies. So that's, known as allergic sensitization. So we'll do it in two ways. We'll look at blood samples and see if they have antibodies against environmental things that you might react to, such as grass, pollen, dust mites, cockroaches. And then we'd also test on their arms to see if they had responses, immune responses on their arms that you could record. So that was a project I was involved in. And after 2 years on this project, I got a scholarship from the Wellcome Trust for a master's in epidemiology and population health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which was another great experience. And it was a very rigorous course in epidemiology. And then I realized that I really liked combining immunology and epidemiology, immunoepidemiology. And that's really, studying immune responses in different populations and comparing them. So after my master's in London, I returned to Ghana to work on a bigger project that was also focused on immune responses in school children, but a much larger number, and also looking at the role for the relationship between parasitic worms, infections, and the allergic immune response. And this was a huge project that was funded by the Dutch government, and then also there was money from the European Union, and collaborators were in the Netherlands. So that meant that I had the opportunity through this project to go and do my PhD at Leiden University Medical Center in the Netherlands. My PhD thesis was still on the question of what is the relationship between parasitic worm infections and the allergic immune response in Ghanaian school children.
Next, Dr. Abena Amoah talks about how these early experiences led her through a long, winding path to a current role in understanding vaccine responses. So what's the connection between the now and the past?
Yes, that's a very good question as well. So, the path after PhDs, I think for lots of people who completed PhDs, there's always the feeling that suddenly life will get better, perfect. You have opportunities will suddenly open up for you, which is true. I've noticed that if you're in a field of research, if you don't have a PhD, sometimes if you want to go further, especially in the African continent, it's very hard to say, okay, I'd like to take up this academic position, but you don't have a PhD, so there are some, it does open doors in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the path that most people take is that after their PhD, they go on to do a postdoctoral experience. And I did that. I took up a postdoctoral position for London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in London, but based as an overseas staff full-time in northern Malawi. And this was in a research site in northern Malawi. So directly after my PhD, after I had wrapped up some of the pending papers in the Netherlands and research, so I spent about a year doing that. I took up this position in a country I'd never been to, and with people I'd never met before in my life. And I just packed up my bag and I headed to Malawi from the Netherlands to Malawi. And it was a gamble, but it ended up paying off because I had such a good experience. So I was based in a rural area in a overseas research site for London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I worked there for a year. And the idea, I was following the PhD track of where you apply for a fellowship, so I applied for a Wellcome Trust fellowship, and they had funded my master's degree. So I was, very excited about it, going on in this purely academic track. So you go from postdoc straight to maybe an assistant professor to an associate professor to a full professor, and so I was very excited about that. And then this fellowship would help, so I got as far as the interview stage for the fellowship. I went to London for the interview, very nerve-wracking 15 minutes. They asked the questions, they grilled me for 15 minutes. It seemed like it was a whole century long interview. After that, I didn't get the fellowship, so I was very disappointed by that. And then at that point, I really realized, do I want to do pure research or do I want to combine it with other things? So at that point, I went back to Malawi, and then my contract had ended in Malawi. So the idea was either to what to do next. So I went to Ghana to reflect on it. And then my PhD supervisor, who had supervised me up to 2 years previously, was like, oh, do you want to come back to the Netherlands just to reflect? And, and I was like, oh, that's not a bad idea. So I ended up back in the Netherlands. There, I was in another postdoctoral position, but instead it wasn't a pure research position. It was also working as in program management. So being part of the program management team for a multi-center study that was being conducted in Madagascar and Gabon. And that was looking at the effect of treating for this parasitic worm infection I mentioned earlier, schistosoma infection, in pregnant women, and how it improves health outcomes in their infants. So that was a multi-center study. It was funded by the EU through the EDCTP scheme. And so that was great. And I was in that position for 3 years up to 2019. And it was an absolutely wonderful position. So it allowed me to combine research with a little more program management, rolling out this program, helping with the rolling out of this research program in 2 different countries. So that was amazing. And it was multi-center and all. So this is where, I jumped around a bit, because here I was, I'd gone from Leiden in the Netherlands to Malawi working for London School, and then came back to Leiden in the Netherlands, and you would never guess what happened next. So then my previous employer in London, based in Malawi, contacted me to say that, if you're interested, if you know someone who's interested in applying for a position, which was a position of an assistant professor in London and also / science program manager in Malawi. So you'd be paid again by London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, working for them, but based full-time overseas in Malawi again.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, this is very intriguing, because this position was definitely not the postdoctoral position, was a step up. So it gave you much more responsibility. So you were going to be in charge of a rural site, so doing all the research activities in a rural site in northern Malawi. And there were a whole bunch of new studies that were about to start. So you had to be in charge of all the field work, recruiting new field staff, training them, and then also helping with the rollout of these studies, do your own research as well. And then also at the same time, as an assistant professor at London School, you had academic obligations, which included research and then teaching master's students, supervising master's students for their project work, and then also teaching on courses, which was mandatory, and then also marking exams and so forth, and then of course giving lectures. So then I took on this dual position, and was amazing for the next 3.5 years. And it was quite amazing, I must say, but very difficult during COVID. So that one was doing epidemiological studies in a population study. And we had a nice immunological study on COVID at some point, thanks to COVID. So so that was where I was actually until 2022. I was in that position. And my contract ended in 2022. And then I had to decide whether to stay for longer, which was possible, or to do something else. So, yeah. So I decided actually to extend my contract, but I actually ended up leaving early because again, then I'm back in the Netherlands because my PhD supervisor, who I've worked with, who's now my mentor, and actually, is got a prize from the Dutch government. It's called the Spinoza Prize. And she was awarded money to set up, to do with this prize, you can do whatever you want to do, actually.
Okay.
So what she had in mind was to set up a knowledge hub that brings together researchers from different parts of the world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, to look at vaccine-related responses. And so she actually talked to me about and thought of me, would you be interested in helping set this up? So this is a completely different position. So I could do research on the side, but this one is really as an advisory position. So I'm here now as an advisor in the department, setting up this knowledge hub. So that's what my current position is.
I think it's really cool that you mentioned that your mentor
has this focus on getting people from sub-Saharan Africa to explore vaccine effectiveness, vaccine responses. Because since COVID, Africa has been giving attention to how can we get our own vaccines. A couple of countries, I think Rwanda and South Africa, I may not be so correct, but I think Rwanda, they've already started implementation of plans to start producing their own vaccines, and I think South Africa also has that in the pipeline. So there's been this conversation, and actually there's been a couple of action towards ensuring that we get our vaccines, and that will be, of course, relevant to our populations, because a couple of researchers has shared concerns about how that some of the immunotherapies, vaccines that are developed, they are not developed on the African continent. So there's always a challenge of will they be effective for our populations? Will they be how will our populations respond to them? So I think we could just talk more about how you see your role solving or exploring some of these challenges and providing solutions to them, since you're exploring vaccine responses in different populations across the world.
Okay, great. That's a great question. Actually, the whole basis of this knowledge hub is really focused on vaccine responses in low and middle income countries. And it is focused specifically on vaccine hyper-responsiveness. Now, just to explain what that is, over the years, a number of research studies have observed that there are striking differences in immune responses to vaccines across different populations. So, for example, you had also touched on it when you just mentioned the development of vaccines, and maybe the effectiveness is different, or the efficacy is different. Efficacy is different in different countries. So, for example, the malaria vaccine, one of the malaria vaccine candidates that has been under development. So it was developed in the US, and it showed a much greater, higher protective efficacy amongst volunteers in the US compared to volunteers in Equatorial Guinea. And similar observations have been seen over the years when it comes to also the rotavirus vaccine, as well as the established TB vaccine, where the TB vaccine actually, where responses reduced responses were seen in infants in Malawi, actually, where in the site that I was at, but many years ago, compared to infants in the UK. So there are differences in immune responses when it comes to vaccines, but it's also important to be clear that it's not only just in high income versus low income countries. For example, even if you go and take a low to middle income country like Gabon, studies done 20 years ago by the group here that I'm working with, found that the immune responses to both influenza and tetanus vaccine were much lower in a rural area compared to an urban area. So the aim of the Knowledge Hub is to really understand what it is, why are these differences occurring, and how can you reverse this vaccine hyper-responsiveness, so that populations in low and middle income countries, especially in rural areas, are better protected. So the hub actually aims to bring together researchers from around the world to address the question of why there are differences in these population level immune responses to vaccines across different populations. And we also hope that we can provide a platform to share data, methodology, protocols, and ideas. And we're targeting researchers from the global south to come together with researchers from the global north, but really emphasizing equity and equal partnership, so not an unequal relationship. And why Africa comes in is because a lot of the work that we've been involved in here in the Netherlands is with African countries. So for example, we have long-standing, well-established collaborations with researchers in Uganda, in Senegal, in Gabon, and Tanzania. So these are researchers who are generating data that explains this hyper-responsive responses, and some really dynamic, bright minds are working in these countries that are actually based there and working. And they've worked over the years. They've come to the Netherlands for training or to do immune profiling on some very nice advanced technological machines. So not only fax machines, but also mass cytometry, which is a way of immune profiling differences in populations. And so we're hoping that through the Knowledge Hub, we bring together researchers, share ideas and knowledge, and then also come up with ideas, together, working together. But we also hope that, we can also provide some training. So if there are groups around Africa that are working on characterizing immune responses, that I'm in charge of sort of finding, links and potential, and then, if they have young people who want to get training in some of these advanced technologies, come over with their samples, and then of course they can measure the samples here in the Netherlands. So we're also, I mean, it's not only just Africa, but the main focus, a lot of African countries are involved in terms of our focus countries are from Africa, but also from South America, and then also Asia, so specifically Indonesia, and potentially, hopefully, India as well. We're looking into that. So African scientists are actively involved in what we are doing in our creation, in because as you mentioned, Africa usually is, I wouldn't say exactly when it comes to vaccines, it's sort of like, we had to wait for the COVID vaccine until everybody had, had sorted themselves out, and we were the last, and we were lucky that through, a program that had been established with the WHO, that we were actually able to get vaccines in the first place. But, the other countries were made sure that they got, as many vaccines as possible, as many doses as possible. And we were sort of like an afterthought. And then, of course, there were lots of issues with also suspicion about the vaccine and many. So, I mean, there was vaccine hesitancy, but there was also, from what I saw in my own spot in rural Malawi at the time, was that there were lots of people who wanted the vaccine and were desperate, and it was just not available. So we had to wait in line for a long time, So there is a lot about, around vaccines that COVID has taught us about development of vaccines, how vaccines get distributed, and all the inequalities that come with that.
Thank you so much for that response. So I think you've highlighted how you're even going to make sure that you're involving African scientists and African researchers in what you're doing, and even giving opportunities to young people. I think that's really, really important, because like young people are the future of the continent, whether it's research, whether it's politics, in any area at all. So I think it's important, and that there are already some of these plans in place. I know it's a new goal and there's still lots of work to be done, but I think since there are plans in place to ensure that all of these are incorporated into the implementation of the project, we are good to go. So I'm just wondering what some of, I know you said you just took up the role like last year, but are there challenges that you currently grapple with in seeing to the success of the project, or challenges that you anticipate? Maybe just a few of them you could share, and how you hope to manage them. And maybe someone listening to the podcast could also be willing to share one or two pieces of advice with you on how to go about them. So let's hear those.
Thanks for the question. In terms of challenges, I mean, I think after spending about 3.5 years in a rural district in the middle of nowhere, I think I'm up to many challenges after that. So you were asking me about challenges I faced. So I think I was just mentioning that after living in 3.5 years in a rural area, I'm up for any challenge. And I think actually over the years, one advantage I've had with all the different experiences in different countries is that it makes it very easy to learn to adapt to new surroundings, and then changing circumstances, and also with different people and personalities. And I think that one of the challenges one faces in life is really navigating difficult personalities and different ways of thinking. So I think that's always a challenge that I face, that people have different approaches. And so I always have to try and adapt. It's very challenging to try and adapt to, to try and understand where people are coming from. And I think that helps to try and adapt, your own thinking, so that you can accommodate different ideas and personality types and ways of thinking. So you don't have to be too inflexible. You have to be open to ideas and ways of thinking. So in terms of challenges, indeed, I think one of them is that, is to make this as inclusive as possible. Over the years, I don't know if you know much about how research has been conducted over the years in Africa. I mean, from long time, let's say from colonial times, where there was very few ethical considerations that took place, all the way up to helicopter research type activities, where people would just collect samples and then take them off to somewhere else in the world and measure them. And then if you were lucky, the African researchers were acknowledged somewhere in the thank you, not as authors and so forth. So so one of the challenges is ensuring that we are as inclusive as possible, and that we do not do the same or take the same steps, in the very colonial type attitude to research of, I have this, you have, we're trying to ensure that there is real equality and equity rather, even. Yeah, exactly, with the partnership. So that's where I'm struggling a bit with that, just to ensure that we are making sure that, the different, if we do have different voices, we make sure that it's very equal partnerships, because resources come from, this one side that may have a lot of money, with different access to technology and materials and so, but then the other side, the side, like in a lot of African countries, there's the expertise there, and the like well characterized populations that people have been working with, know the populations very well, have the expertise as well, knowing in the differences in immune responses within those populations. So it's getting the balance of trying to make sure that everybody's appreciated and like taken into, like the different areas and expertise, are taken into consideration. So that's one challenge. Another challenge, of course, is that which I don't know if I think this is a major challenge, is also I think the English speaking world in Africa has its own advantages. I don't know, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a lot of focus on, the English speaking research places. So there'll be Kenya, South Africa, there'll be Nigeria, Ghana, all this very Anglophone focus. And I think that another challenge is engaging in some of the Francophone or maybe even Lusophone countries. I find that there's less engagement across, building of networks across African countries. So, and that's a shame. But so we do have links with Senegal and Gabon.
Okay.
Long established collaborations with Gabon. So the Francophone, I think there is links with some Francophone countries, but not many. Maybe some links as well with Benin as well. So nothing with Lusophone Africa, and I think there's which is neglected in a way. So I think that I was just mentioning that there is a domination of Anglophone researchers, or Anglophone researchers tend to just there may be links between Anglophone speaking countries and then less on the links between African countries of like Francophones or Lusophones. That's what I was mentioning.
Interesting.
So that is the challenge.
So I think you have a good grasp of the challenges you would grapple with, and I think that's like a plus for you, because since the possible challenges you could encounter, I think you will already be thinking of how you're going to navigate some of those challenges, right? So I think I'm really grateful you mentioned the the challenge of the multilingual nature of Africa. I know there are these popular broad classifications, but even within some of these countries, there are like not thousands, like hundreds or tens of various ethnic groups that don't even understand that popular. This is an English-speaking country, but then how many persons really communicate to understand English in those nations? So I think that's so that's really an interesting challenge. And I think I should just chip in that it's also a challenge that I'm looking into for the podcast, because I feel like these are an African podcast, and then we are just focusing on English, right? So I'm also thinking actively of how I can have other languages represented on the podcast, and it's something I'm really working towards, to make sure that maybe there are also French, Portuguese, and other versions of the podcast, to make sure that we are representing the African population, reaching out to as many persons as possible. So that's a very important challenge that we have to give attention to in Africa and as Africans.
Dr. Amoah reminds us that our career journeys are not meant to be linear. It's perfectly normal to have pauses, turns, and detours, so we must learn to embrace the path that our journey leads us to. While that's already a huge chunk of lesson to handle, I'm sure she has several other tips to share that emerging and established scientists will find helpful. Let's hear her.
I don't know how it is, but at least when I was doing my PhD, it really was that, once you get the PhD, doors are going to open, everything gets better. I think that there are lots of opportunities. It's important to know what you want. If you want to stay with academia and continue along the academic path, I think you really have to be sure about that. But you have to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, because you're passionate about it. It's very important, whatever career you're in, to do something that you're passionate about. Because the worst thing is to really be in a job that doesn't give you joy. So that's some advice, that you really have to do something that you're passionate about. If you are really wanting to continue on the academic path, I think it's very important to make connections. If you're an undergraduate and you want to continue on a particular path, maybe to do a master's degree, or make sure that you collect mentors. You approach professors about, I'm really interested in this, get their advice, make sure that you interact with them, establish mentors who can back you up, because you do need to, if you're going to continue academics, you have to get letters of support and so forth, and they have to be good ones, people who so it shouldn't be that people are just right to say, oh, I hardly know this person. So make sure you are passionate about making connections and so forth. I think already from undergraduate, it always helps to get research experience wherever you can. So if you are have the possibility of like doing just spending a summer, or like your breaks, just sitting at home and relaxing and playing video games and watching TikTok, I would rather, even from then, it's always important to get as much research experience, but internship experience as possible. So if, for example, you're in Cameroon, I'm just giving an example, and there's a research institute that you know of, and you're thinking, I'm going to be free for my break, I would approach them to see if I can get some experience, because from then on, the experience that you have, you can put it on your CV, you could say, this is what I did, and it always later on down the line, people would always be looking at it and saying, oh, was that what you did? So it's important to gain as much experience as possible, to make connections with people, try and approach people about mentorship, and then also be passionate about what you want to do. I think as well, as you go along, so for the after PhD journey, you have to be clear, there are lots of opportunities within Africa in terms of getting fellowships. I mentioned the Wellcome Trust, they're highly competitive, but they give fellowships to people who are attached to African institutions studying something that's novel and interesting. So if you want to, after your PhD, look out for these fellowships, ask for advice from other people in the field in your country. And if you want to travel, that's also great, but you should also know that if you want to travel, it's always like you always have to build up on something. You can't just say, okay, I'd like to go and do a postdoc in the US, or in Ireland. You have to, when people are looking at would this person make a good postdoc, they're looking at your past experience, So it really is that you have to start early in gathering experiences. That's one thing I've learned, And as well, you also have to have a certain level of flexibility and adaptability. If you want to go and study in Finland, you should know what type of climate and lifestyle, you're going to go and, you have to be open and adaptive if that's what you want. So really follow and make plans, and as it's really important as well. You mentioned earlier about the African continent, and I think you've been touched on how, the youth are important as well. The population structures, the average age in most African countries is the early, it's shockingly even 22 in many African countries. So obviously there are many more young people, and of course, which is great. But at the same time, it also means that there's a lot more competition. If people really want to rise above, they have to be motivated, driven. They have to show they're motivated and driven. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I was just trying to create a simple summary of all the several points you've shared. So you've talked about the need to build connections early on in one's career. So from undergraduate, start building connections, getting experiences, to know what you want and be passionate about it. So even if you have to change, but make sure that you're changing for the right reason, and you're passionate about what you're doing. And the need to have a plan and also be adaptable to both environment and situations.
At a time when the world is learning lessons from and exploring options to navigate the deleterious impacts of the pandemic, especially in the context of vaccine development, Dr. Abena Amoah's work seeks to provide timely and much needed answers. Here in Africa, conversations around developing our own vaccines are ongoing, and although the neglect experienced by the continent during the pandemic gave rise to these conversations, they are perhaps long overdue. Some of the vaccines we currently use to treat diseases do not benefit Africans as much as they are expected to, and the reasons for these poor responses are what Dr. Amoah's work aims to tackle. If you are interested in our work, the HypoVax Global Knowledge Hub website will be up and running in a few weeks from when this episode is published. Visit it at www.hypovax.org.
Thank you for listening to this episode on Immuno-Africa. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to share it with your network. You will learn first about future episodes and get other immunology-related updates by following Immuno_Africa or the Immunology in Africa podcast on social media. See you on the next episode. Bye!